I started my recording too.
Awesome. Welcome, everyone. Hi. Hi, Takashi.
Hi.
I'm sorry, I joined later. So Emily, you said that they should be muted without, or for the beginning, maybe.
Yeah, so I think in general,
Okay.
like I want to just encourage discussion and stuff. So feel free to unmute if you have questions or you want to say things. But like in general, keep muted just so that like it doesn't get out of control. Should we get started or do we want to give it a couple more minutes? Nice shirt, Yitka.
Yeah, thanks. And you know, we have the competition that everyone can participate in our t-shirt lottery. Everyone who is sending us voice message, I am an A-lifer, he or she can be awarded.
That's awesome.
Join the Slack channel t-shirts, I think. Yeah.
Yes, I confirm.
So maybe we can start? And
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Were you gonna say a couple things at the beginning?
Should I start?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome at A-Life 2021. It's online conference because we are not able to host all of you in Prague this year. Anyway, I hope that you will enjoy this event, and I would like to say thank you, Emily, that you organize this ISAL summer school, which is for everyone, not only for participants of the conference. So feel free to invite your colleagues or students or friends, and it will be recorded, so you can watch it later. But I think all things Emily will say in later. So just I wanted to say hi and see you all the week. Yeah, and if you have any troubles or questions, feel free to contact me. You know my email addresses, or use Slack or other platform. I will try to respond to everything. So bye for now. Enjoy the summer school.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction, Yitka, and thank you for all of the organization that you've done to make this conference happen. I'm super excited for it. Yay, Live 2021. Cool. Okay, so I'm gonna share my slides. And let's see. Okay. Let me just pull up the chat so that I can see if people say things. Okay, cool. So hi, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 ISAL Summer School. I'm Emily Dolson. I'm an assistant professor at Michigan State University. And yeah, I just first want to just thank all of you for being here. I'm super excited that we have so many people here. I'm really glad that this is happening, and I'm glad that you are all here. So first of all, just wanted to go over the schedule. So these times are all in CEST for consistency with the rest of the conference. So for those of you who, like me, are not in Prague, you might need to do some adjustment. It is the morning here, so you might see the sun hit my eyes at some point, but hopefully that won't be too much of a problem. So yeah, the overall schedule for today is we're going to start out with an introduction to kind of the field of A-Life as a whole in very broad strokes, the history and the philosophy. And then after that, we're going to have 6 shorter form talks about kind of specific subsets of the field. And so currently on this schedule, I have Mark Bedeau listed as giving the talk, but I'm not actually seeing him in the participants list. I think there might have been a time zone confusion or possibly some technical difficulties on his end. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to sub in and do a history and philosophy of A-Life section, unless he shows up, in which case he's welcome to take over. I'm sure that what I do will not be as in-depth as his because he was there for the entire history of the field and I have not been, but I know we've got some other very experienced A-Lifers in the audience, so I will very much encourage anyone else to jump in with questions, comments, anecdotes, anything like that. And so what I prepared is not going to take the full 1.5 hours. And so I'm thinking after my kind of history and philosophy of A-Life section, we're going to go to a talk by Dave Ackley, who is another person who's been around for pretty much the entirety of the field and has a lot of really good perspectives on this. That talk is a bit older, which is why I hadn't been planning on using it in the summer school, but it, I think, will capture some of the points that I will not be as able to capture. So we'll watch that together, we'll discuss it. Hopefully, you know, by our powers combined, we can come close to matching what Mark would have done. So yeah, that's what the schedule will look like. And so just first of all, some logistics. So most important thing is I want to encourage all of you to ask questions. You know, the goal of this is to provide an opportunity for all of you to learn more about the field. And the best way to do that is by asking questions. You know, I've tried to prepare a set of things that I think are probably the most important stuff to know. And I think, the other speakers have also tried to do that, but we can't know what is in your head and what you don't know and what questions you have. And so, yeah, the best thing to do is ask questions. During the short form talks, do that during the chat, and discussion back and forth in the chat is heartily encouraged. I am keeping an eye on it as I talk. And then after the talks, we'll have short sections for out loud discussion and questions. And during the history talk that I'm about to give, I encourage questions either out loud or in the chat. Because this is going to be a little more informal because I was not planning on giving this talk. Yeah, I will encourage any interruptions, tangents, discussions about interesting things about A-Life. Other logistics, please be respectful. ISAL has a code of conduct. Please follow it. It's pretty much what you would expect in terms of treating each other nicely. We will kick people out if necessary, but I don't anticipate that being an issue. Just wanted to put it out there. Right. It has been pointed out to me. It is not a code of conduct. It is an anti-harassment policy. There will be a code of conduct hopefully coming in the future. And then also, I just wanted to point out that this session is being recorded. So if you are not comfortable being recorded, then do not say things out loud or show your video. But I also hope that you'll all say things out loud and show your videos and that you'll feel comfortable doing that, even though we're recording it. Okay, so I think that's all the logistics. So let's get started. So the first thing I wanted to address is, what is the ISAL Summer School? Because I think when I first went to one of these, I did not know what it was, and I didn't even really know what it was by the end of it. So I wanted to start by explaining what it is. So first of all, ISAL is the International Society for Artificial Life. We are the society that is in charge of, helping support the field of artificial life, making it strong, running the journal, making sure the conferences happen, putting together the website, making sure there are resources available, just doing whatever we can to help make this field as strong as we can. And so that includes running the summer school. And if you have questions about ISAL, feel free to ask. I'm on the board. I know a number of other people here are as well. And yeah, we're always looking for fresh ideas. And so then the summer school specifically is a chance to learn the basics of the field of artificial life. And we think that's especially important for this field because for most other conferences you'd go to, if you go to an ecology conference or a physics conference or a math conference, you've probably taken some introductory classes in that field and you have some sense of what that field is about. But most people don't have a chance to take an intro to artificial life class. Some people are very fortunate and do have that ability, but it's not common. And so most people who come to A-Life their first time or their first few times don't necessarily know what it's all about, or especially don't know what all the different subsets of it are about. You might know kind of your specific area that got you interested, but then there's this whole other part of the field that you just don't know about. So the goal here is to kind of fill in the gaps, give you a chance to prepare just in time for the conference to actually understand what people are talking about. And so yeah, the first ISAL Summer School was in 2014. They've happened not quite every year since then. I think there definitely wasn't one last year. I'm not sure about the year before that, but they've been fairly consistent. And so yeah, this one is this year's. I have changed the format a bit this year. In previous years, it was kind of 4 long form talks. Whereas I decided that, especially for this online format, having more shorter talks to kind of span more of the areas of A-Life would be more useful. So I'm totally interested in any feedback you have on that format and whether that is good or bad. So yeah, feel free to let me know about that at any point. Okay, so that is all kind of logistics-y stuff about the summer school. Any questions about any of that before we dive into this high-level overview of the field? Okay, I'm going to keep going, but as I said, please ask all of your questions. Okay, so here I go, attempting to give an intro to artificial life. So what is artificial life? Oh, good question, Mizuki. Where will recorded videos be uploaded? So all the individual videos for the talks within this are going to be uploaded to the conference YouTube. I need to talk to Yitka about the overall video of the whole thing. I'm not sure like how they're going to be broken down. So yeah, definitely some of them will be on YouTube, and I will check about the rest. Good question. Cool. Okay, so what is artificial life? Well, I think my favorite definition of artificial life is the study of life as it could be. This was Chris Langton's definition. He was one of the founders of the field back in the late 80s. And I think this really kind of captures the spirit of what artificial life is, because it's the fields of research that lets us explore what are all of the other ways that life could possibly have been. And that's both in the short term, like, oh, what if, you know, this species had started getting slightly different mutations than it did, but it's also in the incredibly long term, like, what if evolution had gone a completely different direction? What if the origin of life had looked different? What are all the other ways that life could exist? And so it's this very expansive field. And consequently, it unites a lot of different fields. It's kind of aggressively interdisciplinary. It brings together computer science, biology, philosophy, art. There's other fields in there too. There's some physics. Really, it's a very welcoming field of people from all backgrounds. And that's one of the things that I love most about it. No one is scared to kind of get their hands dirty and learn about something completely different from what they've studied. And so artificial life kind of naturally falls into 3 different categories. And obviously I just said that, you know, it's interdisciplinary and all the borders are fuzzy, and the borders between these categories are fuzzy as well. But for thinking about kind of broad categories, they're still useful. So the first of these is soft life. This stands for software. So it says any artificial life that is instantiated inside a computer. And so this includes things like cellular automata here. So a cellular automaton is a program where each cell in this grid is basically an individual, and each individual is going to get updated in some way on each time step. And the rules for how the individual gets updated are based on basically the rest of the grid. And so the kind of most well-known original cellular automaton was Conway's Game of Life, but there are lots of others as well. These were very popular earlier in the history of the field when we had more limited computational power. Since kind of the early days, we've gained a lot more systems to study in soft A life. So I think cellular automata have become less dominant, but there's still very cool research being done with them. Alyssa Adams in particular has done some really great work on kind of using them as a system for studying emergence in, and kind of, yeah, a system that is complex, but not so complex that it's not possible to get a handle on kind of some broad strokes rules for understanding what will happen. So that's one example of a soft A life system. Another one here, this is Avita, and you'll probably hear more about that in Luisa's talk on digital evolution a bit later today. But just broad strokes, Avita is a system of self-replicating computer programs. You can kind of think of them like domesticated computer viruses. And this is another kind of classic, commonly used artificial life platform. This is commonly used for studying evolution because for reasons that Luis will explain, these computer programs evolve to be better at doing what they do. So that's a really great platform for kind of studying evolutionary questions. And then, I mean, there's tons and tons of software systems in artificial life. I'm not going to be able to cover all of them, but I just wanted to give you a sense of kind of what some of them are. So one other class of soft A life that I think is really cool is artificial chemistries. And so this is kind of taking the question of, you know, how else could life have been, like down a level of organization. So life on Earth is very much governed by the chemistry that we have here on Earth, but theoretically you could have a different chemistry. And so artificial chemistries let us ask, okay, like what kinds of systems could we have gotten if our chemistry looked very different? And so this is an example of a figure from Penny Faulkner Rainford's work. This is a Jordan algebra chemistry. The details aren't super important. It's basically a chemistry based on this obscure branch of mathematics that not many people use, but turns out to have really cool properties if you use it as a chemistry. And so this lets us ask all kinds of questions, again, about complex systems and kind of how you can get emergent stable properties or replication dynamics. And you can kind of use this to ask questions about what are general properties of chemistries as a whole, and kind of what conditions does a chemistry need to have for it to do things like be conducive to the evolution of life. Oh, and I see Luis has posted a cool link in the chat about more cellular automata. Thank you, Luis. So yeah, that's a general overview of some of the soft A-Life systems. Like I said, there are tons more. I mean, I think soft A-Life is one of the most unrestricted segments of artificial life because you can create so many different kinds of A-Life in a computer. The next category is hard A-Life, and this is basically robotics. And there's also lots of different types of robotics that people have studied in artificial life. So this, for instance, is a hexapod. There's been a lot of work on evolving behaviors for hexapods. And that kind of highlights the fact that, so there's a few ways that people approach robotics in artificial life. One big one is evolutionary robotics, which Sam is going to talk more about later today, which is basically using evolution as a tool for creating robots that are better at doing stuff. But there's also other approaches to robotics that exist within artificial life that we're not going to have anyone talk about today, basically just because we didn't have time. But there's also been some really cool work on cognitive robotics, which is thinking about how do we create robots that have like theory of mind so that they can better interact with other robots. There's also been lots of cool work on swarm robotics, such as these, where you've got a bunch of robots working together to accomplish a task and you need them to cooperate. And swarms in general are another really big topic in A-Life that we're not going to talk a bunch about today, but that I definitely encourage you to check out because they're super cool. And then just to highlight the fact that, like I said, these boundaries are fuzzy. A lot of robotics work in A-Life happens inside computers where we are simulating robots. So these are some soft body robots. I think, again, Sam is probably going to talk about these, which have recently been brought out of the computer. But again, just highlighting the fuzziness of the lines. Yeah, and thank you for supplying that name, Lana. Or sorry, Olaf. Yeah, it is Alyssa Adams, and yeah, they have been doing super cool stuff in their dissertation. And since then, they've also been doing cool stuff, but it hasn't been cellular automata. It's been other cool stuff. Yeah, so that is hard A-Life. And then so the last category is wet A-Life. And so wet A-Life is synthetic biology. And synthetic biology is basically anything where we're trying to build something in a biological system. And so this spans from very simple systems like droplets, which I believe Sylvia is going to talk more about later. But to just foreshadow a little bit, droplets are a really cool system where you can basically combine chemicals inside a liquid and it will behave in different ways based on the way you set it up. And you can basically get lifelike behaviors out of these incredibly simple systems, which is really powerful for kind of understanding what are the minimal components necessary to get systems that behave in these ways. You can also increase in complexity a little bit to protocells. Protocells are basically more complex than droplets. They're more like cells, but they're not quite cells. They probably have a membrane. They might have some RNA inside them. They definitely don't have like a nucleus. They generally don't have DNA, but they're kind of a nice intermediate form that people can use to study kind of more standard genetic engineering some of the time. People will actually try and build protocells that have certain genes in them to accomplish certain goals. And then another really cool type of wet A-Life that is kind of different from these is this chemical system. It's kind of the wet analog to this artificial chemistry. So this is some work done by Lena Vincent in David Baum's lab at University of Wisconsin. And they're doing this really cool thing where they're doing this experiment where they're moving basically these little rocks that have chemicals on them from one flask to another over time, kind of to mimic the process of like propagating bacteria that people will sometimes do in wet lab biology. And basically what they're looking for is systems within this chemistry that are kind of like self-perpetuating or self-stabilizing, or are in general doing something non-random. And so again, they're kind of looking for emergent properties, but in this wet chemical system. And so again, it's really cool. We have these like different subsets of A-life, but they all tie back to each other in all sorts of different ways. Okay, so that is the overview of the subsets of A-life. Does anyone have questions about any of those before I move on? Ooh, DNA computing, awesome. Thanks for the link, Luis. Oh, and thanks for finding Lena's paper, Olaf. Yeah, I really appreciate all of the people participating in the discussion in the chat. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. But again, if I say anything that like sparks a question or like someone wanting to know more about something, like I said, the amount of time that I'm going to talk for is less than the amount of time that Mark would have talked for. So we absolutely have time to go on interesting tangents and learn more about more parts of A-life. We've got a really great group of people here to be able to answer questions. And yeah, my goal is for you all to leave today comfortable with like, in general, what people talk about in A-life. Okay, so the next question that I think all of this potentially raises is, why do we even study A-life? And there are obviously a ton of reasons that any one individual person might study A-life. You know, someone's specific question might have motivations that are different from these. But you know, in thinking about all of the reasons that I'm familiar with, I think they largely fall into these categories. So the first kind of broad category is to be able to understand or predict kind of complex lifelike systems. And there's a few reasons you might want to do that, and a few different types of systems you might want to understand and predict. And so I think the biggest class is just complexity and complex systems in general. There's a huge field of research just on kind of understanding complexity and understanding like how we can even take a complex system and turn it into something that we're able to predict. And if you're interested in knowing more about that, definitely check out the Santa Fe Institute. They do a ton of work on this, and they've got a really great resource on their website called the Complexity Explorer. And there's tons to learn there. And there's definitely a lot of overlap in the way that they think about things and the way that we tend to think about things. So yeah, that's one thing you might want to, and I guess a kind of corollary to that is there's a lot of questions that people have in artificial life about complexity itself, and like, how do we get a complex system, or how do we get the evolution of complex organisms? Like, how does complexity arise from these very simple organizing principles and rules? Another kind of complex thing that is a little more specific that people might want to understand and predict is evolution. You know, evolution is kind of one of the major forces within lifelike systems that we understand as a process that kind of drives them. And so it makes sense that it's a major set of dynamics that we study in artificial life. And it's also a valuable thing for us to be studying in artificial life because it's so hard to study outside of artificial life. You know, we often talk about the fact that the Earth is an N of 1. So it's very hard to actually make inferences about how life evolved on Earth because we can't ever do any replicates. But in artificial life worlds, we can do replicates. And so we can ask questions that are really essential to understanding evolution that we would never have been able to ask outside of artificial life. And so it's really powerful for that. Similarly, ecology is kind of one of the other main organizing forces behind lifelike systems. And I'll talk more about ecology in my talk later today. But it similarly is like kind of a set of principles and forces for like how a group of agents are going to interact with each other and what kind of the emergent effect of that is going to be. And so again, that's something that we really would like to understand, but it's hard to study it in nature because it's such a complex system. And so being able to study it in A-Life is a really great way to improve our understanding of the biological analogs. Another thing that we would love to be able to understand better is the origin of life. Like, how did that happen? What are ways that could possibly have happened? And artificial life is a natural home for research on that because, the entire question of how could life be, what are the other ways it could be, is really central to the question of like, how did it actually come to be in this case? And so there's a bunch of really cool work on understanding possible models for the origin of life. And then lastly, astrobiology is another field that people often come to A-Life from. Because in astrobiology, we have a similar question of like, okay, so if there were life on some other planet that it doesn't necessarily share a common origin with life on Earth, how would we be able to recognize that? Like, are there common signatures of life that we would be able to recognize? And again, this is something that we can start to get at if we have a larger class of lifelike systems to look at. So yeah, those are all different things that we might want to study artificial life so that we can then turn around to understand and predict. The other major thing that people want to do with their artificial life research is build stuff. And so, I talked about how hard A-Life is robotics, and often the goal there is to build better robots. And artificial life can be a really great tool for that, because a lot of times if we're trying to build a robot in like a lab setting, it doesn't necessarily encounter all of the complexity of what, a real organism in nature would encounter. And there's reason to think that that might be part of why some of our robots aren't great at adapting to new circumstances. And in general, there's reason to think that lifelike systems that we see in nature have succeeded at being able to function as being autonomous entities. And so if we're looking to have robots that do that, being able to harness principles from lifelike systems makes a lot of sense as a way to approach that problem. Another thing that we might want to build is computational algorithms. And so one major one that a lot of people here work on is evolutionary computation, which is kind of a subfield of machine learning, where basically we're doing machine learning using evolution. And so the basic idea is you create a population of possible solutions to a computational problem, and then you choose the ones that are closest to solving the problem, and you make copies of them and you mutate them. And over time, because evolution works, you end up with actually pretty good solutions to the problem. And so by better understanding evolution, we can improve that machine learning algorithm. But there are other computational algorithms that people are also working on kind of pulling out of A-Life systems. So Dave Ackley, for instance, has been doing some really cool work on this kind of very different paradigm for computing, where you've got a bunch of programs running in parallel that can't necessarily talk to all of each other and that don't have any guarantees of actually working. It's super cool. If he gives a talk this year, I highly recommend going to it. They're always fascinating. But the point is that the algorithms that he's working on developing for that computing paradigm are all based on these lifelike approaches, because we basically have the same problem in life, that we have these kind of messy systems where there are no guarantees and we need to have a group of agents work together to solve a problem. And so that's another situation where there are computational algorithms being pulled from A-Life. A third thing we might want to build is art. I think we all find lifelike properties to be kind of beautiful and inspiring, or at least many of us do. And so they're a logical topic for art. And also A-Life systems can in themselves be very pretty. And art can be a good way to kind of engage with and understand them. So art is a major part of these conferences, and I think that's a really cool thing about them. And then lastly, synthetic biology is basically all about building things. We could be building bacteria to pull plastics out of the ocean, or we could be building bacteria to sequester carbon, or we could be building more complex ecological communities to achieve some goal that we have, which I'll talk more about in my talk later. But there's tons of stuff that we might want to build with A-Life. And then lastly, the third reason that we might study artificial life, and I think this is like a legitimate reason, this is not just a joke, is because it's really cool. Like, I think that is like actually the motivation for a lot of people, and I think that that's good. One of the things that's really cool about artificial life as a field is, we're not only just academics studying it. We have people who do it as a hobby, or people who do it as like a job, but not an academic job. And I think that that's really great, and it really enriches our community. And the reason that we have that is because A-Life is cool. Okay, that was a lot of talking on this slide. Does anyone have questions or thoughts? I see there's been some good discussion in the chat. Okay, I'm going to keep going. So the other thing I just wanted to call everyone's attention to is, so today's videos are going to cover 6 kind of subfields-ish of artificial life, to the extent that you can easily split A-Life into subfields. But I had a whole long list of some subfields that I and some other people brainstormed. Shout out to Anya, thank you for helping brainstorm. And I just wanted to kind of talk through these so that you know that they're out there, and that you know what they mean when you see them. And I've already mentioned some of these, but so yeah, artificial chemistries, like I said, are, how else could chemistry work, basically, and they are super cool. Yeah, I definitely recommend checking out Susan Stepney or Penny Faulkner-Rainford's work on those. Cognitive robotics is another field that is definitely within artificial life. It's like thinking about robots as living systems, just not from an evolutionary perspective, more from a perspective of like, how do you engage in learning within a lifetime? And how do you, have a robot that like adapts to its environment so that it's able to process information? There's a lot of cool, somewhat philosophical work in that field on, what does a robot need in order to really be able to learn within its lifetime? Like there's a debate over, does it need to be embodied? Does it need to, experience stimuli in a certain order? And there's been lots of cool research on that. Some of it kind of tied to human development research. There's also this topic of complexity and complex adaptive systems that I mentioned before. And so, yeah, like I said, complexity is like a topic in and of itself. And complex adaptive systems are basically complex systems that have a component where they're adapting. And so I think my first few years of coming to A-Life, I was like never totally sure what complex adaptive systems are, but really it's a fairly broad category that encompasses a lot of what we study. Ooh, that's a great question, Olaf. We should totally discuss that later. Another debatable subfield of A-Life is biological modeling. So I think, we're always kind of having this debate over like, what exactly is A-Life? Like, I think we can define what the core of it is, but because it's so interdisciplinary, there are a lot of kind of like fringe fields like spiraling off from it. And it's unclear which ones it's like subsuming and which ones it's not. Certainly, most people who do biological modeling don't think of themselves as doing artificial life. But I would argue that some of them should start thinking of themselves as doing artificial life because they are. So biological modeling is really just anything that you're doing in a computer where there's like a targeted biological system that you're trying to recapitulate the behavior of. And it's true that that tends to lend itself to a different flavor of system than a lot of A-Life systems, but not a wholly dissimilar one. Then I talked a lot already about origin of life as a subfield, but there's tons of really cool work being done on that. Swarms are another thing I mentioned. So swarms are cool because, we've talked already about a few processes that operate on groups, evolution and ecology in particular. But swarms are like a different kind of group because they're generally, I mean, I guess you can have either homogeneous or heterogeneous swarms. So they could either be all the same or not. But it's generally a different problem because you generally have control over the swarm. It's not like a question of what's going to happen so much as a question of how can you best make the swarm do what you want it to do, which is its own very difficult and fascinating problem. I already explained evolution. And the last one that I wanted to touch on, which Mark would have definitely done a better job than I'm going to be able to, is philosophy of artificial life. So one of the really cool things about life as a field is that it's got this philosophy component, which makes sense because philosophy is very concerned with questions of what is life. And artificial life is probably one of the best scientific fields in which to ask those questions. And so there's a whole philosophy side to this conference that thinks and asks those questions. And yeah, I think it's super worth checking out. I am not qualified to explain it at all. Okay, I'm going to just pause briefly to look at the chat because I see there's been a lot of discussion. Yeah, I agree with what Sharon said about biological modeling. Cool, yeah. Awesome. Yeah, I will say to answer Olaf's question, I think what brought me to artificial life was I was really looking for like a way to combine computer science, evolution, and ecology, and like artificial life was the perfect field for that. Okay, so lastly, I just wanted to talk about a few kind of classic A-Life results. Most of you have probably heard of these, but you'll also probably hear people just make reference to them during the conference, like on the assumption that everyone knows what they are. So since the goal of this is to give a broad strokes introduction, I would feel remiss if I did not show you these. So the first is Strand Beasts by Theo Jansen. These are really cool giant analog computers that are also like literal artificial life forms. They're entirely wind powered. They don't have any kind of like electronics in them at all. They just figure out how to behave based on their analog computation in the wind. And he's got a variety of these roaming along beaches. Another very classic artificial life result is Carl Sims' Evolved Virtual Creatures. So this was done back in the 90s. And so this was like very challenging computation. Like this was an impressive amount of computation back then. But he was able to evolve these very lifelike things, even using these like, you know, large blocky structures. And this really inspired, I think, a ton of people to get into the field because it's just so cool. And yeah, so he evolved like tons of these different creatures. I think one of the things that people found particularly notable is how lifelike a lot of them looked and how they seemed to mirror behaviors of animals that we see in nature. And then the last kind of classic result I want to talk about is Conway's Game of Life, which I already mentioned before in the context of cellular automata, but I just wanted to show you what it looks like. And so this is a glider gun, which is kind of a really commonly discussed structure. So these things that it's spitting off here are gliders. They're entities that basically are going to be able to move forward. And people talk about them as like a really interesting example of like something that's very much on the border of being an independent agent or not. And so yeah, if you hear people talking about Game of Life, you'll probably hear them refer to gliders as an example of a thing that you can build in Game of Life. And so now you know what they are. And the glider gun is just a thing that emits gliders. Good question, Takashi. So I was a little uncertain about whether Mark would be able to make it because he hadn't responded to my email that I sent at the beginning of this week, just confirming with everyone. And so I did prepare a bit because I was concerned. I mean, I'm still sure Mark would have done a much better job. Okay, so I think that is everything that I have. So I want to pause and ask if people have any questions or topics they'd like to discuss further before we go to Dave Ackley's video. Yeah, Alana, the fact that Mark doesn't use emails is what made me like extra unsure, because I was like, I don't know if this is just Mark not using emails or if he actually hasn't gotten this information.
Thank you for the super interesting talk, Emily. I have a question for you. So you presented some classical A-Life results, and I think it's kind of the the favorite results of everyone. And I was wondering if you had to add a very recent result to these classical results, which one would it be?
Oh, that's such a good question. So I think the reason I like shied away from recent results is that I'm worried they'd just be biased towards like, the people that I happen to know. Like, let's see. I mean, okay, this still isn't that recent, but like, I mean, I think novelty search and like kind of the whole sequence of work that like Ken Stanley did coming out of that, really maybe the minimal criterion coevolution thing where he has the mazes that are co-evolving with the maze solvers. That's probably the best example I can come up with, because that's like clearly an A-Life thing in that it's got this like host parasite thing going on. And it's also like cool mazes. And it also has implications about evolution. So I can definitely see that becoming a classic. I mean, I'm biased by my academic lineage, but I also think that like a lot of this stuff with the effect of limited resources on evolution of complex features in Evita could become a classic. I mean, that's also, I guess, getting a bit old now. But there's some work on that will eventually come out that will, I think, maybe be cool. Let's see, other classics. I mean, so Lisa Soros's Chromaria system is just so pretty that like, I could totally imagine that also becoming a classic, because again, it like has good implications, but is also pretty. I'm trying to think of something that isn't in the evolution realm, because that's the realm that I am usually in, and so it's where I see the most recent results.
I think it's fine to let your bias talk. I wanted
Fair.
to know your answer. Thank you. Yeah, these are all very interesting works.
I'm curious if other people have kind of recent results that they think will become classics.
Well, since I asked the question, I can,
Yeah, go for
can
it.
answer my own question. I really like the work on neural cellular automaton, because I mean, I think it's super recent, right? I'm not sure if there was work on that before, but I think it's really super recent, and it's so fun to play with it because it's so robust, and at the same time you can make some small parasites. It's just a lot of fun.
Yeah, I agree. I see Luis is suggesting Ulam and Lenia, and I agree, those are both super cool. So just to connect words for people, Ulam is Dave Ackley's system that I mentioned, where he's got the kind of like, parallel programs working together to solve a problem kind of by best effort. And Lenia is just this beautiful system by Bert Chan, which just like, it's so pretty. You should Google it. Just checking chat to see if I'm missing anything. Cool. Okay. Are there more questions? Okay, if not, then let's go to the Dave Ackley video that I mentioned. So yeah, like I said, this is a bit old. It is from 2013, but it is like aimed at being an introduction to artificial life. And I think most of what he's talking about is like really kind of fundamental philosophical stuff that hasn't changed. And so I think it's still achieves its goal. And so hopefully what I just did provided some of the stuff that's happened since 2013, and then this can provide more of the historical perspective. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to totally encourage everyone to keep discussing in chat, because I think that's like so helpful for like getting more people's perspectives and context. Okay.
Today I want to talk about artificial life, something that I worked on
Whoops.
for a lot of years. A lot of the research I've done more recently. This is another New Mexico CS for All video for the class we're doing on computational thinking and programming. All right, the very idea of artificial life is kind of a weird, because we normally think of life as natural. Nature is full of life. But we need to come up with a definition broad enough so that we can see other kinds of things as being life or life-like. And in fact, that's the distinction that we'll talk about immediately after. The weak claim is that these systems are merely lifelike. The strong claim is that these systems are actually life. Whether it actually makes a concrete difference in any particular system is unclear, but it does make a difference in our expectations. We'll take a look at some demos and then try to wrap up as quick as we can. This is my big area, so I like to talk about it. The meaning of life. Not just a movie by Monty Python. Here's a dictionary definition. The state of being which begins with generation, birth, or germination, ends with death. Anything that happens in the middle. This is sort of a catch-all. It's not completely satisfying. It's a description of what happens during a life, rather than some sort of necessary and sufficient conditions for what it means for anything to be a life. Many people have taken cracks at coming up with such a definition. Here's two. A self-sustaining chemical system capable of undergoing Darwinian evolution. A self-organized non-equilibrium system such that its process is governed by a program, stored symbolically, and can reproduce itself. Now, both of these talk about systems. They both talk about them doing something on their own, sustaining, organizing. They have slightly different emphases. Gerald Joyce is a chemist, perhaps not surprisingly. Lee Smolin is a physicist. When I, as a computer person, see program and particularly see things like symbolically, those are little red flags to me. There's a lot of stuff that has to be explained when someone invokes program symbolic representations and so on. I want to boil it away and make it as simple as I possibly can. My favorite definition. Now, I got this from my dad. The internet seems to think that this is maybe from Doctor Who. I'm not sure. If anybody actually has any references to this in print, I'd be interested to see a citation. The key point of this is the preserving. So a big umbrella definition. Life is a system that dynamically preserves pattern. Okay. Now you might think you'd be able to preserve a pattern without being dynamic about it, like Mount Rushmore. You just make it big and you make it out of rock, and then the pattern will persist. The pattern will be preserved. But in fact, even the mountains come down eventually, and it turns out Mount Rushmore, every fall, the National Park Service gets out there and repairs it, plasters up Lincoln's nose or whatever it is, what they do. So the larger system of Mount Rushmore plus people are dynamically preserving that pattern, but the lifelike part of it is really the people more than the Mount Rushmore. Okay, so this is clearly extremely general, and we're going to have to admit that there might be some things that aren't really as lifelike as other things. I mean, even a little eddy whirlpool in a stream that, if you moved one pebble, it would disappear. it has a dynamically preserved pattern. The water flows by and you see it. It lasts for some period of time. That's going to have a little bit of life according to this view, according to this definition. So this fundamentally is sort of computational paganism. Wherever you look out in the world, if you see a pattern being dynamically preserved, that is a little bit of life. That is a system that's a little lifelike. And then it's a spectrum. Okay, this is plenty of room for what we need. Okay, so now we can build computers, computer programs, whatever, that will display this kind of property, that will dynamically preserve their pattern. What are those computer systems that we build? Well, that depends on the stance that we want to take to them. We could take the weak claim and say that this computational system is a model of some living system. And when we do that, our goal is to understand something about life, or understand something about whatever system we're claiming it's a model of, and ideally we'd like to be able to make predictions about whatever it is that it's a model of. Okay, let's take a look at an example. All right, here is a model of the world, everything. It's been running for a while here, day 2,400 and something. What it is a 100 by 100 grid with mountains all around it that nothing can get through, and spaces inside that can hold things. You may see these little flashes every so often. Those are, I'm imagining, lightning bolts. Any given time step, any given square has some probability of just zapping whatever is there. And that's our model of stuff happening, that whatever else goes on in a system, if it's going to be a realistic model at all, it's got to have some process of tearing down, decay, time passing. Okay, so let's dynamically preserve our pattern. Well, let's take a straw man first here. Okay, this guy, he's now sitting in one of these squares, and all of these little creatures that I've implemented, the way they work is they look at, when it's their turn to go, we're scattering the turns around into every square in a random order and then doing it again. When it's this guy's turn to go, he looks at one random spot in his neighborhood and does something about it. Maybe he moves there, maybe he destroys and eats whatever's there, maybe he has an offspring, whatever we want to do. This particular guy does nothing. Okay, when it's his turn, he just says, I'm done. All right, and he's preserving his pattern fine, right? But we know that sooner or later the odds are going to catch up with him, and he's doing pretty well. But he's the only instance of the guy. So down here we have the list, the amount of time that we've got, the total number of living things. We're calling this guy living. I call him type S because he just stands there. He's the standing guy. Well, we'll even let him live. But sooner or later, he's going to get zapped by lightning, and then he's gone. So how do we fight against that? We fight against that by reproduction. We fight against that by building a system that can make copies of itself. So here is such a thing. This is a little green square, is like a plant that just grows under the influence of sunlight or some resource that's generally available. And it goes from 1 to 2, now it's 4. Well, one of them got zapped. It would have gone 4. Oh, we lost our standing guy. Okay. He wasn't very satisfying anyway. He was Mount Rushmore. Mount Rushmore just got, lightning hit it. On the other hand, it's very, very, very unlikely at this point that enough lightning is going to hit all of these little type P plant guys to wipe them out. Their pattern is being preserved by copying, and that's the basic living trick. We start out with one guy, then we had 2, then we had 4, and it's often used as an example. Let's let this speed up a little. of an exponential growth process. 1 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 2, times 2 is 4, and so on. It's worth noting that this growth process that we're watching right here, time 3,800, 3,900, 4,000 coming up, this is not actually growing exponentially. Why not? Well, because very quickly the plants are not limited by their ability to reproduce. The way I program these guys, they can reproduce fast. They're limited by the ability to find empty space to put an offspring in. These guys never actually move. When they wake up, they look at one of the randomly picked neighbors, and if it's empty and if they have enough energy, they split. They give some to, they create a new plant in that position, and then they reduce their size by somewhat more than what they gave. All right, let this go even faster. All right, and what we end up with is this, ocean full of plants that are occasionally zapped by lightning, and that creates an empty spot, and then one of the neighbors fills it in, it regrows, and so on. Okay, the basic pattern preservation idea of life, it's about amplification, it's about reproduction, and it's doing great. Obviously, we could have other things show up in this world, like in particular a herbivore. Whoa. So what happened there? We sort of missed it. It was so quick. The herbivores, when they get a chance to move, they look at a random square. If it's empty, they move into it. If it's occupied by a plant, they eat it. If they have enough energy, they might create an offspring where they used to be. And that's basically it. So they just sort of move around randomly, and if they happen to have a plant next to them, they try to eat it. And what happened? Well, we had an absolute explosion in the population of these, and now they're extinct, the herbivores, the H's. They're gone. So if we let this speed up, the plants regenerate themselves. And now, if we look at the classical mathematics governing predators, in this case, the prey is the plant and the predator is the herbivore. It's like if the plants had lookouts, they'd be look out, here come the vegetarians. In the classical mathematics of it, the continuous mathematics of it, it's not possible for anything to actually go extinct. So the herbivores would become very small in number. That would allow the plants to rebound, and then there'd be plenty of food, so the herbivores would reproduce and eat them up. Here, of course, there's always that possibility of the last guy dies, and in fact, that's what happened here. Let's try it again. We'll stick in a herbivore, and he eats, he reproduces. They reproduce 200, 300, 400, reproducing very rapidly, and basically a plague on the land, just sweeping across it, eating everything, and once again, they've all starved to death. Now, if we can get lucked out, let's see what happens here. We will get a system which this might do it. I think this might do it. If we can get a system where there's enough small patches of plants that have a few of the herbivores sort of scattered around in them, then in fact we can get to a rather stable circumstance, and this will do it. Let's go to full speed here. All right. So the herbivores are chasing around after the plants are getting eaten, but then the herbivores are having famines and starving, plants are regrowing. This is quite stable for as long as I've been watching it, as I've been setting up this video. But it's only a small piece of what we would normally consider a living system. If the standing guy wasn't very realistic because he just sat there and tried to preserve one single pattern flawlessly, the limitation here is that whenever the plant reproduces itself, its offspring is always absolutely identical, down to every last teeny bit of behavior and every possible parameter. Same thing with the herbivores. The copying process is absolutely faithful. Let's take a look at another example. All right. So we've got our stuff happening again. Let's put in one of these evolutionary plants, which you can't really see there. The idea here is this plant has some genetic information that tells it tells him what kind of color he wants to be. All right, so this is sort of a pale blue-green. And now we're going through the exponential growth phase, 1, 2, 4, which will quickly give way to a quadratic growth phase in this case, because our world is two-dimensional, so the periphery only grows that fast. But the difference here is that every time one of these plants has an offspring, the offspring's color, either its hue or how intense it is, may shift slightly. Okay, and you may already be able to see that off on one side here. The color is a little different. If we let it speed up, it should become more apparent. Yeah, so now we're sort of getting some blue, purple stuff, and we're getting some sort of greener, yellow stuff, and it's kind of starting to look like a clown wig or something like that. Now, why are these colors changing? They're just changing because of drift, because the only way that these plants move is by having offspring. The offspring have little mutations, so the further we get from the center where we started the guy, with the more generations down in terms of the plant lineage that we are. All right, we've got a evolving herbivore. Let's get one of him going. And the idea with him is, he has a particular color that he'd most like to eat. So the main color of his face, this guy would sort of like to eat a sort of light cream color. So the food that's around him, the plants that are around him, not his favorite food. That means he has when he tries to interact with one and tries to eat it, he won't succeed as often. That's the way I've made this work. That when you get a good color match, yum, you chomp it down. When it's a bad match, you're more likely to just not be able to swallow it, and you don't get any energy that day. But once again, when you have a kid, the kid's preference for what color and what amount of saturation, how intense the color, slightly modified compared to yours. Okay? And these guys are starting to reproduce and spread a little bit. Let's speed this up. All right. What's going on here? The 200 to 50. They're spreading. Now, unlike the original herbivores, which just ate everything, these guys are more selective. It seems like, well, down here anyway, they kind of like the greenish stuff, and they're sort of leaving the bluer, purpler stuff behind. And as a result, the green stuff is starting to disappear from the world, and the blue and purpler stuff is filling in the empty space left behind. We now have an evolutionary system where the plants are evolving under the pressure of the herbivores, and the herbivores in turn are evolving under the pressure of the food sources provided by the plants. Okay, so what's going to happen in the long run here? Maybe we should let this cook for a while and talk about some other stuff and then come back and see what's happened here. All right. So was that model, all right, is it a model of a living system? If so, what living system is it a model of? Was that green stuff supposed to be algae, or these little white dots? They're snails. It was not actually a model of any specific system. And one of the terrible problems with the weak claim of artificial life is that it's really hard to make a specific, accurate model of an actual living system, because actual living systems are so sort of gnarly. They kind of depend on all sorts of different things. And because they have that amplification step, because they have that reproductive step, with a system that has amplification, small differences at one time become big differences later on. They can become big differences. And as a result, the small details of the living system may in fact make a big difference how the system works over time. So to make an accurate artificial life model of any natural system, a specific species interaction, what have you, is very challenging. There's a lot of parameters that have to be set. I mean, how fast do these plants grow? How fast do they gain energy? When do they try to split? How much energy do they give to the offspring? I just sort of made up parameter values for all that stuff in order to make a demo that showed some effect. So coming up with predictability is a challenge. But on the other hand, if you sort of back up a little bit and say, well, I'm not trying to model algae or any specific living system in the natural world. I'm just seeking to understand how living systems act in general, across many different systems. They act a lot like this. They have reproduction with amplification and so on. Okay. Well, if we're not talking about the weak claim that this is a computer program which is just a model, as we've been talking about all through this class, then the alternative is making the strong claim. The strong claim is that a computational system can literally be a living system, and that we need to bend the definition of living system and or computational system until that can actually be true. The difference between taking the strong claim and the weak claim, again, is a matter of emphasis. With the strong claim, we don't necessarily care about modeling any particular system. It's the difference between trying to model flight by making bird wings and modeling flight by making jet engines and aluminum wings. With the strong claim for artificial life, the focus is just on building systems that actually do something that potentially is useful, or at least useful to somebody. So, do we have examples of this? Artificial systems that are out in the world doing work, that are reproducing, Well, here's one example. This is data from 2001, it's kind of old now, from UCSD, showing the infections of the code red computer virus. And we can watch it over time. At midnight, there was a few hundred. By noon, by 6, 7 a.m., there's thousands. By the afternoon, there's tens of thousands. By the evening, there's hundreds of thousands all over the globe. What we end up with, essentially, is a map of Microsoft software usage as of 2001 on the entire globe. This will go around one more time. So, unlike the demo that we looked at first, the little world in a box, it's confined to being inside computers, yes, but it's all over the planet. And since then, there have been many other sorts of these things out in the wild, getting transmitted by internet or floppy disks or picture frames, all sorts of things, USB keys. And they actually do stuff. They may do stuff just to computers. The Stuxnet virus last year did stuff in the physical world. It caused physical machines to wobble and destroy themselves. How real do you need it to be before you say, well, that thing went out It worked its way through communication channels, reproducing itself, found its target, and destroyed stuff in the actual world. So I think there's some pretty strong basis for the strong claim that computational systems can be living systems. Since I think I am a computational system, I need the strong claim. You do too. All right. Let's check back. Oh, whoa. What has happened here? Well, the blue stuff has sort of gotten eaten up. And look at this now. We've got these red guys in the red patch. We've got some blue guys down here. And all kinds of things. Oh, there's some green guys down here. There'll be some, well, okay, all right. So it looks like what's happening now is yellow plants seem to be kind of spreading out of the southeast because there isn't anybody who's really eating them. But we know what'll happen soon enough. It looked like they were red guys here. They're already getting lighter up here. So where we used to have sort of big solid blue, a monoculture of one type, now we've got lots of little patches of quite different colors near each other. And what looks like endlessly churning, but if you step back, kind of stable ecology. Okay, so let's mop it up. If we take the strong claim that computational systems can be living systems, these days we can start, and well, there's a new area called living technology, which is focused specifically on the strong claim. It's saying we can build living systems that are lifelike in some way. We can build them out of hardware, that's like robots and stuff like that. We can build them purely out of software. It's the kind of stuff that we just saw here. We can build them out of wetware, that sort of carbon-based chemistry, water solvents, the stuff that we are made of. And hopefully, we can do something useful with them for society. It drives me crazy that if you look at artificial living systems today, the example of the strong claim of A-life that I picked is a bad one. It's one that is tearing stuff down. The code red virus, Stuxnet. It's difficult, not impossible, but it's difficult to find really decent examples of using reproducing systems for good. For the overall benefit of society. And I think that's got to change. And so my current research area is focused on how can we re-engineer computing, how can we rethink computing to take advantage of more of these lifelike principles. And so now it looks like the plants are cycling back towards white to some degree. I mean, you know, the important point, well, there's a lot of important points, but one important point about life is like what Woody Allen said, you know, 90% of success is just showing up. Life fills space wherever there's enough resources to support it, and that means it can be there when the extraordinary event just happens to happen somewhere. And okay. That's it. Thanks for watching.
Awesome. That was a strong ending. Cool. Thank you all so much for participating in the discussion in the chat so much. This is great. I love all the questions that everyone's asking. So in particular, Michael just asked a great question. Could someone enlighten me on a project that has had some interesting impact? I imagine a lot of us have good answers to that question. I'm just quickly going to catch up on what people have already said. Yeah, okay, people are saying it depends on what type of impact you're looking for. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the cool things about stuff in A-Life is that there are just so many different types of impact that the work can have. So definitely there's a lot of examples of impact where we've learned useful things about science, definitely about evolution, about ecology. There's also some really cool situations where people have built things that work. Yeah, Sam Kriegman is going to talk later about evolutionary robotics, and I'm hoping he'll also talk about his xenobots, because those have definitely had an impact. Let's see, Jeff Clune's hexapod robot also, like, I guess I don't know if that's being like used yet, but there's always this gap between like, doing cool science and it actually getting applied to things. Yeah, do other people have good examples of kind of A-Life work that has had like a tangible impact? Ooh, life science, clinical, social impact. Great question. So I guess this is debatably A-Life, but it's like an adjacent to A-Life field. So for my postdoc, I was studying cancer evolution. And specifically, the goal was to stop cancer from evolving resistance to drugs. And so there's kind of a field called mathematical oncology that's like the intersection of like A-Life and cancer research. And so there's a few people in A-Life that study cancer kind of from that perspective. And basically the gist of that whole line of research is that by taking kind of an evolutionary biology and ecology perspective on cancer, we can actually like stop cancers from evolving resistance to certain drugs. And it's still all early stages, but there's like a prostate cancer clinical trial that is like the evolutionary therapy is remarkably effective. Like as in none of them have died yet. And like in the control group, they've all died. So yeah, that's an example from kind of the clinical side. And yeah, like I said, it's not explicitly out of A-Life, but it's out of this same kind of thinking. Oh yeah, survival with lattice is a good one. Although it's, I guess, a little more abstract. Awesome. Okay, so there's lots of good discussions still going on. I'm just gonna consult the time and the schedule that I said we'd use. Okay, right. So cool. So we're supposed to have a break starting at 3:45, which for me is 9:45, so in 25 minutes, and then pick back up at 4 p.m. So in 40 minutes. So I don't want to cut this discussion off. So let's keep chatting as long as people want. I don't want to get too far off the listed schedule for the talks because people might be planning on joining later. So yeah, I think open discussion until the hour. And feel free to like unmute yourselves and chat out loud as well, since we're not watching anything now. Cool, yeah, lots more good examples in the chat. Yes, Sharon, 40-minute break, because we did not manage to talk for quite as long as Mark would have, and because there was a break after Mark's talk. Cool, yeah, some good discussion of ODEs versus individual-based models.
Carl, do you want to explain your thought experiment out loud?
Hey, Lana, thanks for inviting. But to be honest, this is like really, really, I don't know what is a good expression in English, but it's kind of like a stream of, oh yeah, that's the expression. It's just a stream of unconsciousness thing. I'm pretty sure that if anyone took a hard look at what I'm saying, it would come down as a house of cards. So not sure. I mean, it was just people were saying like, okay, is production necessary to life? And someone said, oh, no, we can have a stable organism. But if a stable organism that does not reproduce, like, what is it doing? Is it doing anything? Is it doing nothing? I don't know. If it's doing something, then is this something actually reproduction? So I'm not really, it's really incoherent. So if you would like to take from there, I would be happy to let you continue.
Okay, I wasn't sure what the experiment was, but now that you've explained, I think I can understand what the question is. And I feel like maybe it depends on the scale. For example, if tomorrow I become the only human on Earth and I'm also immortal, my cells will continue dividing, for example. I cannot reproduce, but inside of me, if you look at a smaller scale, you can find some things that reproduce, like my cells. So maybe with the definition of life that we saw that, life has to reproduce, with that definition, I'm not alive and yet my cells are alive.
That's one thing though I don't like about that interpretation that you're making, is that
it's not that I'm making an interpretation. I'm just trying to explain what the definition would mean if it were true.
But that's the thing. The definition can be true. Maybe if you don't reproduce for any particular reason, but your prototype, so a human being can reproduce, but you in particular cannot reproduce. But I think that because the prototype can reproduce, you still count as alive, even if you in particular by some reason cannot reproduce.
So you're saying that instead of considering the particular situation of the thing that we are observing, we should have some kind of general model of that thing, and then consider whether this model can reproduce.
Yeah, I guess because I have this background on evolutionary computation, and in my mind, individuals don't evolve. Groups of individuals, like societies, evolve. So if you get a definition of what is alive and you're looking at one individual, that I think that you're kind of trying to stretch the definition beyond usefulness. Because why do we need definitions of life, right?
I'm not a big fan of definitions. I think a definition is only valid in the context that you're trying to do something. Like you're trying to achieve a task, and then you need the definition to do your task, and make a definition.
Okay, I agree with that.
And actually, I didn't really follow the beginning of the conversation, so I don't know where this definition came from that it has to reproduce.
I think they were talking about seeds.
Okay.
I think people were talking about seeds. If seeds are alive or something like that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, I agree that like definitions of life are useful, like with respect to a certain problem you're trying to solve. So like if you're working on origin of life, you probably need to like define what you're looking for the origin of. But also like, yeah, it's a nebulous concept and we're probably never going to find a perfect definition.
I think I kind of also like to, when there are just definitions that are kind of floating around and you don't know in what context they were made. It's interesting to find the limits. Like, yes, the child of a donkey and a horse is apparently not alive. That's a funny thing to say, I think.
Definitely.
Yep, I agree.
So it means another like philosophical aspect of this is still according to that definition, if tomorrow all humans die and I'm alive, or say there are two humans left on Earth and they are both alive, and then one dies, even if the other is alive, officially it's dead because it can't reproduce anymore. Like the death of something else means you're dead.
I think that was Yuri's original question that like sparked this entire line of discussion.
I think so. And I agree. I mean, technically, you're right. But I think, like you said, definitions are good if you want to do something. And I think the original context is that we're defining things that are alive as things that reproduce. So we have systems where things reproduce. And if you start to say, oh, but what if all humans died? Then technically, if you take the reproduction by the letter, I think that's the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, if you understand what I'm saying. Sure, technically, yeah, it's not alive, but I think the spirit that generated that definition in the first place, I don't know.
Maybe the definition was more made for a context where like you don't have access to all of the information about that individual that you're looking at, that thing that you're looking at. And so you don't actually know, if it doesn't reproduce, you don't know that it can reproduce, for example. And so you assume that, okay, I don't see it reproduce, therefore it's not alive.
I suspect also it's probably safe to assume that like Dave didn't mean it as like a hard and fast perfect definition, but as a like when we're first introducing the idea to new people, right? And not have to use words like entropy and mechanisms for the persistence of information and substrates and all that good stuff.
Especially since he also said life is a continuum.
I think that's also a big general question. How do we deal with continuums? Like, is there any other ways than just saying, okay, I put a threshold here because, you know, I don't know where else to put it?
I mean, I think again, it comes down to like, why do you need to turn the continuum into a binary? And like sometimes you do.
Although usually it's a question of, I don't know how to write a program that, you know, does this continuous things.
That's definitely the most common reason, I guess.
Are there other questions about life that anyone has?
Did we want to come up with more examples about impacts that A-Life has had? I feel like that's always a fun discussion.
Yeah. I feel like we should just like have that list like somewhere accessible.
I was looking at the chat here and I see that Anya is saying that she says that it's a good asks students to come up with exercise, with definitions of exercise. I think that's super cool. I think one thing that would be really cool, it could be kind of a game, is that we try to come up with some definition of life and someone else tries to come up with some living beings that breaks the definition.
I've seen the exercise frequently put forth as like proving that sand dunes are not alive, like giving like 4 different like examples, like some of which are like viruses, I think are a good one to include. And then like, you know, typical sexual organisms, asexual organisms, then like sand dunes or rocks. I mean, people have said rocks, but sand dunes are like even better, right? Because they like grow and split and move and everything.
Fire's a good one too. Oh, I agree with you, Luis. That is a really good insight that I've also gotten from my life. But I share your bias.
See the question here in the chat. What is the purpose of reproduction? I think it's maybe a bit, it can be misleading to ask questions like, what is the purpose of something? Like, what is the purpose of life, or what is the purpose of reproduction? Because when first self-reproducing organism that appeared didn't really have this goal of reproducing. It happened that they were reproducing, and therefore they colonized a lot of different environments, but it did not appear as really a goal to do something, I think.
Yeah, I really agree with Lana here. I mean, if you have something that reproduces, just like in the simulation that Dave was showing before, just by the fact that it's able to reproduce, even if it was like, oh, I broke, but I continue to exist, and I break and I continue to exist. Just by that alone, if you don't do anything else, that creature will just take over everything.
Yeah, I guess to go back to the original question, like, yeah, why isn't it enough to just have something stable? I think it's because, like, if you have like one thing that's stable, it's like if you have like one grain of sand on the beach that is like stably preserving itself, assuming grains of sand were something more complex than they are. It's like you would never find it or like know that it was doing something interesting. Whereas the things that are making copies of themselves, like, you see it, they have like a big impact on the world because there are so many of them because they keep copying themselves.
Another advantage of reproduction is that if you're just a stable something, I mean, stability in general is not good in life. Usually if you're stable, you die because you can't, life is about adaptation. And if you're stable, it basically means that you don't really engage with the inputs from the environment. And what you really want to do is not be too stable and instead adapt to what changes.
Right, yeah, that's a good point, that like stability itself like might not actually be a practical thing to achieve in the long term. It might be easier to make copies of yourself.
And of course, you could say, there is just one organism, but it adapts very well to everything. Therefore, it's still kind of like preserving itself. But I think, yeah, one of the advantages of reproduction is that you can have a very dramatic change in the way the organism is adapting to the environment. Usually when it's like a difference between learning and having a kid, the kid will be very different from yourself. Whereas if you're just trying to learn to adapt to the environment, it usually takes some time, and your mutations cannot be, very, very big.
Yeah, definitely. I like that. Adaptations as happy accidents. I think the whole question of like being stable versus making copies of yourself, like, particularly comes up in that chemical evolution context that I briefly alluded to earlier and will allude to again in my talk later. Like, the concept there is that we've got these like soups of chemicals where like some of the reactions will necessarily cause certain chemicals to be present more. And I'm working with some people that are studying that right now, like we're trying to like write a grant. And like one of the like kind of big problems that we're running into is trying to like define whether it's evolution versus just like it being kind of something that is self-stabilizing. I feel like it's almost the same question of like, is being stable enough, or like, do we need actual replication?
Very vaguely related to questions of stability. Anya said something about, I mean, she wrote, she didn't say, about the environment being perfectly stable. And it goes back to some questions in astrobiology. I think that, I mean, of course, the environment is not perfectly stable, but at the same time, species like humans are trying to make it this way in a way. We're trying to say, if the environment changes too much, we suffer, therefore we should have some kind of stability. And we kind of have this ideal of an environment that wouldn't change at all the species stay the same, they stay there, and therefore we don't really have to suffer and adapt. And I wonder if that's kind of the end result for all civilizations. Like if you become very, very powerful, what you will do is just say, okay, now I don't want anything else to change.
I don't know. I think that might be a little bit anthropocentric.
Oh, it definitely was about humans.
Yeah, I know. This definitely happens with humans, but I wonder if that is necessary or we just had like a bad luck in that regard.
I think it's like, I mean, adaptations always come with a form of suffering, especially if it's through evolution and, you know, like you have a bad mutation and then you die. And we try to avoid that the most that we can. And I don't know if you can really have evolution or adaptation without a degree of suffering that you would want to avoid.
I mean, that's the problem, right? I mean, I could imagine that like we didn't evolve this much aversion to suffering. In some reason, we get a much wilder degree of like exploration. But of course, that's just absolutely like in the world of the mind. So we that's the point that I really would like to be able to see other alien species and see how they're doing if that really is like a convergence point. Do we all avoid this risk avoidance, this aversion to pain? Do we all evolve that?
Yeah, just having like one other completely separate instance of like evolution in the physical world would be so nice.
I actually have an astrobiology project where we try to find some biosignatures based on information theory. I also want to find n equal to. Actually, just before coming to this conference, I was watching Men in Black.
Nice.
Where there is a lot of examples of n equal to.
Oh man, Men in Black is very natsukashi.
It has a special emotional value for me because the first time that I went to the astrobiology conference, I skipped one day of the conference to go to the cinema, and they were playing Men in Black, and I thought, wow, it's so ironical if I went to see a movie about fictional aliens instead of going to the conference about real aliens.
Looks like we've got a really interesting question from Jet in the chat. I am just working on wrapping my mind around it.
This is the fundamental question behind open-ended evolution, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Which means actually we don't really have an answer to this question and we really would like to have one.
Oh, yeah. So open-ended evolution, which is a phrase you'll probably hear a lot. It's kind of like one of the biggest questions that people in A Life are asking about evolution. And the kind of central question is like, what conditions are necessary and or sufficient to bring about evolution that is like interesting? People have a hard time defining what exactly they want to see with open-ended evolution, but they want to see things like increasingly cool ecologies, increasingly complex individuals, that kind of thing. And it's evident that like the kind of standard 3 ingredients for natural selection of inheritance, mutation, and selection are not sufficient for that, because we can easily create systems that have those and they just stagnate. And so clearly we need something else. And so open-ended evolution is kind of asking like, what else do we need? Which I think, yeah, you could kind of view it as like, what else pushes it towards that edge of chaos? Okay, so it's 9:45, which is when the schedule said we would actually take a break. And I know I need to check some emails to make sure that people aren't asking for the Zoom link. So I am going to turn off my video and mute myself, and I will be back in 15 minutes. And 15 minutes from now is also when we will have our next talk by Lana. I'm super looking forward to it. So see you all then.